Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining the Wisconsin Veterans Museum for our first book talk of March, and also our first book talk that kicks off our 50-year commemoration of the end of the Vietnam War for the United States. We have two book talks that focus on that this month, and the first one being today with our author, Marv Truhe. I'd also like to say thank you to our sponsor, the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation, and of course, support for the foundation coming in memory of Pat Finley. So thank you to the Finley family and to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation. And of course, thank you to everybody for joining us on this Monday afternoon for our book talk. As I said a moment ago, our author today is Mr. Marv Truhe. Marv served as an officer in the U.S. Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps, or the JAG Corps, during the Vietnam War. And while serving as a JAG Defense Counsel, he defended 6 of the Black sailors that were charged with rioting and assaults in the USS Kitty Hawk incident. His newest work is called Against All Tides, the Untold Story of the USS Kitty Hawk Race Riots. Marv, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Eric, and I especially thank you for this invitation. I especially appreciate being able to talk to those who are connected to fellow military veterans. I've done several talks here in Colorado to military veteran groups, and again, I really appreciate this. I'm going to talk about the book and how it came about. I do have a PowerPoint presentation that I'll be switching to here, and then we'll just take it from there. Have you got that up now, Eric?
Let's see. No, the PowerPoint is not up just yet.
Okay. I'm going to walk through this and do a share screen. And hopefully this will then come up. Has that come up yet?
No, not yet, sir.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. And now are we off and running?
Yes, sir. You're looking great. Perfect.
Okay. Well, great. Well, again, as Eric said, the name of the book is Against All Tides, the Untold Story of the USS Kitty Hawk Race Riot. The book was just released last October, and it is a story about racial injustices that were committed against young Black sailors during the Vietnam War, more specifically in October of 1972. At the time of the incident, which the book is about, the Kitty Hawk was conducting air interdictions against North Vietnam targets off the coast of Vietnam. And shortly after that day's bombing runs ended, there were several violent confrontations that occurred on board, interracial confrontations, which later became known as the Kitty Hawk Race Riot. And when it was over, there were 25 Black sailors that were charged with rioting and assaults on white sailors, but not a single charge against white sailors, even though my book chronicles dozens of unprovoked assaults by white sailors against Black sailors. And those incidents, of which there were several, were never investigated, and no white sailors were ever charged. Now that alone, of course, should get your attention. And as Eric mentioned, it's a first-person account. I was a Navy JAG lawyer stationed at the 11th Naval District in San Diego at the time, and represented several of those young men at their special courts-martial trials. I actually began the book in 1973, shortly after the trials were over. And my book is helped considerably by the fact that I kept thousands of pages of original source documents from those days. I knew at the time that the trials were going on that this is a story that needed to be told, especially since the local media and national media, for that matter, were not getting the full story. And there'll be more of that later. But those documents, which consist of 5 banker boxes, which I have literally kept for 50 years and taken from various residences over those decades, consists of all of the official Navy investigation reports, all the witness statements, medical reports, all the trial and hearing transcripts, and so forth. In addition, just before the trial started, Congress sent out a special subcommittee to the Naval Station at North Island in San Diego, and they conducted several weeks of hearings. But just as the investigations were very one-sided, the congressional hearings, unfortunately, were also the same. They heard from virtually no Black sailors, none of the defendants, and listened almost entirely to white sailors and senior naval officers. I also had the benefit of taking daily tape recordings on cassettes when I returned from my trials. And those documents were very important, the transcripts of those cassette recordings, in order to make this first-person account have more of the personal detail that you'll find in the book. I started the book, as I said, in 1973, but then life intervened. And I then took up the effort again in January of 2021, a little over 2 years ago. And the book covers the incident itself as well as the military trials. Now, one of the real positive aspects of doing this book is I was able to reconnect with a lot of old Navy friends. We're talking about fellow JAG officers who, for the most part, we've kept in contact. We have regular JAG reunions. We had one in Colorado here 3 years ago. We had another one in Indiana just last fall. But I also reconnected with 5 of the white attorneys who were in San Diego at the time and were retained by the NAACP. And in addition to those, there were 3 Black attorneys that the NAACP retained. And reconnecting with those gentlemen after 50 years was especially meaningful for me. And I made those reconnections because it was important to me that I get the most out of the story that I could, which included not only my experience, but theirs. And another bonus in doing the book was the ability to reconnect with several Kitty Hawk sailors. Some of them were defendants at the time. And I made those connections in the last 2 years. And these were gentlemen that I had not met before, but got to know quite well in telling their stories. And so that was another important aspect of the book preparation, was the ability to connect with all of those people who were involved. I wrote the book to tell the whole story. There's a reason it's subtitled The Untold Story of the Kitty Hawk, because up to that point, most of the reporting that came out from national news and otherwise was very one-sided. And now that's not a criticism of the media, because they were only getting one side of the story, both from the congressional hearings and from the official Navy story at the time. And as a result, I say in the book, if you had not known all of those details, which you couldn't have known at the time, you would have assumed that only Black sailors were involved in the rioting and that all the white sailors were innocent victims and bystanders. In the book, I have a very meaningful quote. The very beginning of the book, as a matter of fact, when the congressional hearings were over, they published an official report released to the national press literally the day before my first trial. And this is what they said. And what they said is unsettling. Quote, "The subcommittee is of the position that the riot on Kitty Hawk consisted of unprovoked assaults by a very few men, most of whom were below average mental capacity, most of whom had been aboard for less than 1 year, and all of whom were Black. This group as a whole acted as thugs, which raises doubt as to whether they should ever have been accepted into the military service in the first place." And after giving that quote in that official report, my next statement in my book is this: virtually every assertion in that statement is pure fiction. And of course, that's what my book attempted to do. And that is why my book contains an inordinate amount of citations, endnotes, over 1,000 of them, taken directly from those original source documents, because it was important that my book be even-handed, be balanced, and be credible. Now, the Kitty Hawk itself was a massive warship, about a quarter-mile long with a 4-acre flight deck and about 4,500 crew members at the time, and that included the embarked air squadrons. And those air squadrons were flying A-6E intruder jets and F-4 Phantom jets, and they were conducting daily bombing runs into North Vietnam. And I talk about in the book of the stresses that were on the young crew members at the time, because those bombing runs were going on for 8-10 hours a day. Flight ops were operating for 16 hours a day for weeks on end. And this particular incident arose after the Kitty Hawk had been in the combat daily bombing runs for 50 days. So again, very stressful for those young sailors. And I mention in the book what those stresses and how those stresses might have contributed to the violence that later occurred. Quote, "Why don't we bring thousands of young men of different ethnicities and backgrounds together under these conditions, most away from home and family for the first time, and see what happens? What could possibly go wrong? Plenty, as it turns out." Now, for those of you who are familiar with the seagoing Navy, you know that disciplinary matters aboard a ship of any size are typically handled in captain's mass on board. These are conducted by the captain. And in this particular incident, in the months leading up to the October confrontation, the new captain of the ship, Captain Townsend, who'd only been on board a few months prior to the incident, he was conducting captain mass in a very discriminatory and one-sided way. When black sailors assaulted white sailors, these are individual confrontations on board the ship, he meted out very harsh punishments at captain's mass. They included 30 days in the brig, diets of bread and water, busted in rank, and fines. But he was also faced with incidents in which unprovoked attacks by white sailors against black sailors occurred. And with only one exception, he never brought any charges against the white sailors. And he always had an excuse for not doing so. And the only time he ever had any discipline against a white sailor was a $25 fine. And word gets around on a ship about this inconsistent treatment of black and white sailors at their mass. These incidents were occurring not only aboard the Kitty Hawk, but also at the port of Subic Bay in the Philippines. This is a slide of the Subic Bay facility. On the left side is the airfield, on the right side is the naval station. And this next one is another photo of the Subic Bay naval base, which no longer exists. But in the background, at the very top of your slide, is what they call Liberty Town, the Longopo City, where sailors would go on liberty. And unfortunately, both on the base and in Longopo City, there were numerous assaults. This is, again, in the months leading up to the incident, in which white sailors had committed unprovoked attacks against black sailors, including one incident in which a white Kitty Hawk sailor was paying Filipino nationals to assault black sailors in Liberty Town. And these are very serious assaults, head and facial lacerations and so forth. But again, even though these were well documented, the captain of the ship took no action whatsoever against those white sailors. Now, all of this set the stage for the incident itself, which occurred on the evening of October 12th, 1972, shortly after the air interdictions had completed for the day into North Vietnam. It actually began with white Marines assaulting black sailors. And those assaults were not because of any actions by the black sailors, but because the commanding officer of the Marine detachment had made the decision because of some unrest aboard the carrier, he ordered his Marines to break up any groups of 3 or more black sailors, not sailors that were doing anything wrong, but just walking through the ship or otherwise meeting on the ship, but not bringing any breakup actions against white sailors who were congregating. And of course, this really added to the tension and the stresses and the anger on the part of the black sailors. And it eventually erupted into the violent confrontations I've mentioned earlier. They lasted for a total of 6 hours on board the ship. And many of those sailors were armed with makeshift weapons. We're talking about broken broom handles, dogging wrenches, pipes, and so forth. So there were a lot of serious injuries. When it was all over, there were 51 crew members who were injured seriously enough that medical reports were issued for them. 3 of them had to actually be flown off the ship for post-surgery treatment. And as I mentioned before, there were 25 black sailors charged and not a single white sailor. It was to the extent that many of the black sailors, including my clients who had been assaulted, could identify their assailants, but the Navy refused to let them make statements and refused to bring any charges. And next, you're going to be seeing one of my clients who figures prominently in the book, Seaman Cleveland Mallory. He was actually closing up the ship's store for the day when 3 white sailors assaulted him, one carrying a lead pipe, and they broke several of his ribs. And he tried to report this, and they would not take his statement. And within 2 days, he himself was charged with an assault in a totally separate incident in which he was not involved at all. It was as a result of a white sailor perjuring himself and claiming that he had seen Cleveland Mallory commit this assault, which never happened. And as a result of this trial, with this perjured testimony, and to everybody in the courtroom, it was obvious that it was perjured testimony because we had an airtight alibi for how those 2 sailors had met in Hong Kong. Cleveland Mallory had never been to Hong Kong. He'd missed the sailing of the ship. Nevertheless, he was convicted and given a bad conduct discharge. Another one of the sailors that I was able to acquaint myself with just in the last 2 years is Durwood Davis. He was the victim of an assault. He was not allowed to make a statement, and he then was later charged with an assault himself. And then finally, there's Perry Pettis, who figures prominently in the book. He was never charged with anything, but he was the victim of a couple of assaults. And again, no charges were brought against him. I had the pleasure of actually meeting Perry Pettis in person in Louisville, Kentucky last fall when I was attending a Navy JAG reunion in that area. And when this incident was over, the young sailors were first incarcerated in the brig in Subic Bay, and a few weeks later they were flown to the Naval Air Station in San Diego. And this is the Naval Air Station. It is actually an island called Coronado Island or Naval Station. And in this particular case, they were not only incarcerated in Subic Bay, they were again incarcerated in the brig in San Diego. And the really sad part about this case, in addition to the other injustices, is they were all put in pretrial confinement. That is confinement before they went to trial, when they were presumed innocent. It's virtually unheard of in the Navy, or the military for that matter, to have any pretrial confinement. And yet all of these young men were put in pretrial confinement. And we tried for months to get them out. We went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and were unsuccessful. And that is just, as I said, one of the grossest of the injustices that occurred. And during the time that they were in confinement, over half of them were in maximum confinement, and over half of those were in solitary confinement. And in the book, I have an excerpt from one of my clients who was in solitary confinement for 50 days prior to his trial. And the incident I talk about is a time when he was in his cell. His cell door was temporarily unlocked for administrative reasons. And he saw a fellow black sailor being brought to the maximum cell block from one of the other brigs. And here's what he says when he eventually, at his trial, was able to testify about that incident. Quote, "I heard him screaming, for me. My friend hollered over to me, said they was ready to bring him to row 6, that's solitary. He screamed to me, 'Here they come.' So then I heard a lot of noise and banging. I hollered out, 'Let him go.' Tears filled my eyes and I felt like black bondage. I feared he needed help, so that's when I went forward to strike the guard. My relationship with him is as close friends. All the guards are white. By black bondage, I mean slavery. That's the impression I had. I got indefinite row 6. And because of the conditions in solitary confinement, another of my clients attempted suicide. He attempted to hang himself in the cell, but fortunately he was cut down. And so the injustices against the black sailors, continued for all of those months. This is the law center where I was stationed for 4 years in San Diego. And that was the site of a further injustice of the government withholding evidence from our defense team. And that defense team, as I mentioned, included JAG officers as well as NAACP retained attorneys. And that included the withholding of statements that our own clients had made. Even though we knew those client statements had been made and we had made specific requests for them, they were withheld for us, and that resulted in several unjust convictions. We were also denied access to witnesses and denied access to further JAG counsel that our clients had requested. And all of those obstacles that we faced as a defense team gave rise to the title of the book, Against All Tides. This photo was taken about 2 years into my tour of duty, and the trials became very personal for all of us, and especially for me. I was very aggressive in my defense of those young black sailors, and as a result, the convening authority, that's the captain, he happened to be the commanding officer of the Naval Air Station, he threatened to remove me as a defense counsel. And because of that action, it never happened because cooler heads prevailed. He was clearly being prejudiced against our clients, the threat to remove me as a counsel, the pretrial confinement, the refusal to give us the witnesses we wanted, and so forth. I brought an action against him. And I filed a motion to have him removed as convening authority because he was no longer impartial. And of course, that gave rise to several hearings. I was unsuccessful in that. But because of that give and take between myself and the convening authority, at one point he asked the law center director to have me court-martialed. And of course, that never happened either. But as you can see, it was a very contentious few months. These trials, it was not a group trial, individual trials only. Most of the cases only lasted 2 or 3 days. A little bit about myself. I'm a farm kid from South Dakota. I received an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering and my law degree from Northwestern University. I was on active duty for 4 years, as I mentioned, in San Diego. Had also some service at the Subic Bay Naval Base Law Center. And I was a lieutenant, and I served both as a lawyer and a military judge. After my service was over, I was assistant attorney general back at my home state of South Dakota, and then I practiced in Rapid City, South Dakota. This is a picture of the law center courtroom. It's a very small courtroom, but we had national coverage from both coasts, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, and daily TV coverage. So the trials at the time were a big deal. And of course, with Congress being involved also, that led to even more publicity. And the next thing I'm going to tell you about is a very positive thing, because most of what I've told you is very negative. But when my client was convicted on perjured testimony, Cleveland Mallory, it was the second case to go to trial, we were just shattered as a defense team because he was totally innocent. And so we made a decision that if we could hire an undercover agent to befriend the white sailor who had perjured himself, we thought that we could get him to admit that he had perjured himself. Now, that seems like a pretty big order, but we had an excellent undercover agent. His name was Billy Hicks. He was actually attending law school in San Diego at the time, but he was a former Marine officer and a former FBI agent who had worked undercover for the FBI. And since the NAACP was involved, they put up the funds to hire him. And he did, in fact, befriend the perjured white sailor. And over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, while wearing a secret wire, he was able to tape the white sailor admitting that he had committed perjury. And as a result of that, those tapes became national news. The NAACP actually had a national press conference in New York City and distributed those tapes to the media. And when those tapes hit the streets, it made a complete change in the cases, because there was a realization for the first time that these investigations were one-sided and that the charges were totally one-sided and so forth. And the prosecution cases started to fall apart at that time. And as a result of that, many of the white sailors who had already gone on record as saying they could identify black assailants, they began retracting their statements. And from the outset of those tapes becoming public, there were several cases that were dropped, a total of 6 outright acquittals, either drop charges or acquittals at trial. And out of 23 of the black sailors who were charged with rioting, only 2 of them were ever convicted of rioting. And that's pretty significant when you think about the Navy having treated this as a shipwide chaos and rioting solely by black sailors. And another positive outcome was that the Navy started backing off in charges, and everybody who was convicted was found guilty of lesser charges, and all of them received relatively light sentences. And another, what I consider a significant victory for our defense team, is that not a single one of the black sailors received a bad conduct discharge. The only exception had been my client, Cleveland Mallory, but his conviction was reversed on appeal when those perjury tapes became known. As you might imagine, in a book about racial injustice, there is some discussion about racial discrimination in general and racial discrimination in the Navy in particular. And while I don't pretend to have any unique insight into racial injustices and so forth in our society at the present time, I do have a very unique perspective when it comes to the racial injustices that were occurring as a result of the Kitty Hawk incident. And this is one of the quotes I have, statement that I made in the book. Quote, "Well-meaning people of all ethnicities, all beliefs, and all persuasions, who would never for a minute consider themselves to harbor any racial or other prejudices, are a product of their environments, upbringing, and life experiences. As such, they can hold prejudices without any inkling of how their statements or actions may come across to others. In those situations which may never manifest themselves overtly, their true character and feelings are revealed." End quote. And I discuss at length in the book about how some of these actions being brought against the black sailors might have been prompted by these more subtle forms of discrimination and racism from people who maybe did not have a clue that they even held such feelings. And one of the other positive outcomes of the Kitty Hawk incident was how the Navy reacted to these trials. There was another incident that occurred 2 months later in port when the sister ship, the USS Constellation, another carrier, had a sit-down strike where 110 black sailors refused to return to the ship while it was in port because of their demonstration against the injustices that were happening on captain's masts and promotions and so forth aboard the Constellation. But as a result of those two incidences, the Chief of Naval Operations, who was at the time Admiral Zumwalt, some of you may recall the Z-grams of Admiral Zumwalt. He had come in as CNO just a couple of years before these incidents. And he made it one of his strong pledges that he was going to try to aggressively combat discrimination in the Navy. And he made this statement: "It is self-deception to think that the Navy is made up of some separate species of man, that Navy personnel come to us fresh from some other place than our world, and that they become untainted by the prejudices of our society which produce them. They do not," end quote. And as a result of this and Admiral Zumwalt's actions, military-wide, every branch of the service had to undergo special training, special classes, dealing with discrimination. And many of the groups of veterans that I've spoken to recall that they were having to attend those classes. And Admiral Zumwalt laid down such a hard line that he even had a special gathering of admirals in Washington, D.C., and he told them that he was disappointed in their efforts at responding to discrimination in the Navy. And he, quote, invites Navy officers to do not view improved race relations as their critical duty right now to retire from the service, end quote. Now, one of the responses I often get from military veterans in my talks is whether my book is an indictment of the Navy itself. And these are from people who have yet to read the book. And I hasten to tell them it is not an indictment of the Navy. I do not allege systemic racism, as that term is used today, throughout the Navy, but I definitely is an indictment of certain individual senior officers. And that distinction is important. And I am happy to say that I've gotten very favorable responses from military groups. Well, this is a good example, the Military Veterans Museum in Wisconsin. But I've gotten favorable reviews from the Vietnam Veterans National Organization, the Military History Now website. I was recently on a podcast, a military history podcast called Point of the Spear. And I'm especially proud of the fact that the San Diego Union Tribune published a front page article in their Sunday edition on my book, and a very favorable one. Of course, that's important because San Diego is where the trials took place, and it's some called Navy Town, USA. And another really positive thing is that I have recently been invited to go and speak to the U.S. Naval Academy midshipmen, and I'm going to be doing that the 1st of next month. So all in all, I'm very happy about the reactions that I've gotten from the military. An immediate question, if you're interested in maybe buying the book, you can get it online at many sources, including Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and of course at bookstores. It's widely available at this point. And for those of you who want to know more about the book, following our little visit here today, you can go to my book website. It's just my name, marvtruhe.com. And with that, I again want to thank Eric and the museum for inviting me here today. And I especially look forward to any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you, Marvin. We certainly have a ton of questions for you. Let me go ahead and start my screen share and bring that PowerPoint up briefly. Marv, after all these years, what made you revisit this topic and complete this book?
Well, like I said before, Eric, I had always had in mind I would finish the book. I thought actually I would finish it within a few years after returning to South Dakota. And life intervened. My wife and I started raising a family. And I then was encouraged by a fellow author here in Colorado that I got to know, who has published several books. And when he found out about my story, he encouraged me to take up the writing of the book again. And it was a good timing. I was already retired, living here in Colorado. It was during COVID. And so I dived back into those books, into the documents for the book. And as I said, 5 banker boxes. And going into those documents, as I've said to some people, it made me angry all over again. I was very angry at the time, but having to relive this. And once I started writing, it was just self-generating. I had no writer's block or anything else. I knew I wanted to get the story out. So frankly, it was very time consuming, but it was relatively easy to write the book.
Okay. What happened to the other defendants in this incident, the sailors that you did not defend? Were there a lot of negative consequences for these other sailors?
Well, I'm happy to say, I'm repeating a little bit of what I said before, not a single bad conduct discharge. And for those of you in the military, you know the ramifications of a bad conduct discharge. That was perhaps the single most important thing. And at least in the connections that I've made, there were no negative ramifications for these young men in civilian life. As a matter of fact, at the time, the military had already been granting what they called general discharges under honorable conditions. And so several of these young sailors were given the option of getting out of the Navy early and taking home their honorable discharges. But the ramifications, I would have to say, took place during the time they were charged, during the time of the trials, the pretrial confinement most significantly. But I would say overall a very positive outcome. I never suggest in the book that there were not Black sailors who had committed unprovoked assaults. I wanted to make sure this is a balanced book. But I did, in fact, want to bring forth the fact that the white sailors who had committed the same kinds of assaults were never charged.
Sure, and it's a couple late questions here coming in on chat. After these trials were over with, did you notice in your remaining time in service any shift toward some sort of balance as far as racial tensions go, or did you see this continuing on afterward?
I'd have to say that I don't have any personal experience of any kind of a positive ramification other than the fact, as I mentioned, all the military, all branches were required to take these special training sessions. But since I was not a seagoing naval officer, I was shore-based, I did not have an occasion to see whether those positive things had occurred. And but I do know that just from anecdotal visits that I've had with these sailors, that their personal experiences improved. So yes, I would have to say that all in all, it was a very positive thing. One of the questions I often get asked is whether or not these changes are present today. And again, your military veterans who are presently serving, for example, would have a much better idea. One of the things that came up that I'd mentioned to you earlier, Eric, it was a question that was very troubling to me. It was actually from a military veteran at the Colorado Veterans Museum in a talk I gave. When my talk was over, he asked me, whether or not I would have acted the same if I was not a reserve officer, which I was, as opposed to a career naval officer. And it's a very unsettling question to me, because the implication of that was that I would not have been as aggressive in my defense of my clients if I was concerned about my career. And that's a question I think any veteran should be able to ask themselves, or for that matter, anybody in civilian life, if their ethics and their desire to do the right thing and make the right decisions in those situations would be any different if they were worried about the ramifications on their careers.
Yeah, that's that is an unsettling question. Just to think that there might be people out there who would put these sorts of things aside, or maybe act differently if they were career officers. You would think that, you know, hopefully our lawyers like yourself, Marv, hold themselves to a high standard regardless of what they have in mind for the future. That's I don't even know how to address that one. Next question, Marv. Did Captain Townsend draw any attention to himself with the way he handled the captain's mast? And was there any sort of maybe follow-on judgment or punishment for him afterwards?
That's a great question, and I'm glad it was asked, because I get that question a lot. I actually addressed that question in the final chapter of the book. It's a chapter entitled, "Where Are They Now?" And I'm happy to report that there were repercussions against Captain Townsend as a result of his actions. He had been a very noted, decorated military aviator. He was actually the first commanding officer of the Top Gun School in Miramar, California. So he had an exemplary career prior to this time, but because of his actions, which everybody perceived ultimately were so one-sided and so discriminatory, he never made admiral, and that was unheard of. As a matter of fact, he took an early out from the Navy, and he worked for some civilian companies. He eventually was mayor of a small town in California. But yes, his career took a big hit because of this incident. And I'm proud to say that our work in these trials probably had something to do with that, because we were bringing that to light. Another unfortunate ramification, however, was to the executive officer of the ship. And the executive officer was a black sailor. He was the commander at the time. And he was, well, several of the people in the book, and I quote them, say that he was a hero of the incident because he was going about the ship breaking up these altercations. And he was a pretty special person to many of these black sailors. Unfortunately, his career took a hit also. He should have been assigned as his next assignment to be a commanding officer of a carrier. He was the executive officer of the Kitty Hawk. But instead, and this is hard to even report, his next assignment was heading up the Navy ROTC department in a Texas university. And his career really also plummeted because of this incident, and he never made admiral. So there were some unfortunate outcomes. But yes, I would have to say, by and large, the actions that Captain Townsend had perpetrated on these young men did come back to haunt him.
And Marv, you also mentioned in your talk that that this work is not an indictment of the Navy overall, but certainly of some certain senior officers. Did you yourself experience any backlash after bringing this work out by these officers or maybe their family members?
Not at all. And that's also interesting, because I've gotten that question more than once. What effect did it have on me, either during my Navy service or afterwards? I'm happy to say that largely as a result of the work of our defense team, and I make very clear in my book, this wasn't single-handed. This is a large defense team that were doing these things, representing all of these young men, that they had positive outcomes, and there were no repercussions whatsoever against me or anybody else as a result of this. As a matter of fact, probably the best indication of that is that of my graduating class from Naval Justice School, which occurred just before I and about a dozen other of us were sent to San Diego. Following the trials, my next assignment was as a military judge. And I was the first in my class of about a dozen of us that was given an assignment as a military judge. So definitely there was no repercussions or ramifications whatsoever. And of course, there, as you might expect, there would have been no effect whatsoever on my civilian career. As I mentioned earlier, my next assignment was as Assistant Attorney General in charge of the trial division in South Dakota Attorney General's office. And I think that assignment came about largely because of, on my resume, having the ability to talk about our representation of those young men.
Marv, it amazes me. How is it even legal for the defendants not to be able to make statements about this incident, or even to add on to that, to have information withheld from your defense team?
This
seems outrageous.
Yes, it is more than outrageous. It is just disgusting, and it is a blatant violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And I go into detail about the obligation of the government, not only in military courts, but in civilian courts. The prosecutors have to provide to defense counsel from the very outset all documents relating to the incident or their trials. And in this case, there were hundreds and hundreds of statements that were withheld from us, including statements of our own clients, right up to and including trials. And yes, unfortunately, there are no ramifications for the government. And I made it very clear that these were senior officers withholding these documents. They were not prosecutors. I knew the prosecutors personally, friends with them then, friends with them now. And I know for a fact that it was not the individual prosecutors withholding documents. It was the senior officers. But yes, there were no ramifications for withholding evidence, for not taking statements of the black sailors. I don't know where that order came from. I do know the legal officer was the one responsible on board the ship. He was a JAG officer for taking those statements, and he did not take statements. And I didn't even want to guess as to how that came about, but I suspect it probably came about from a higher authority, and it was not an individual decision on his part. But yeah, these are the sort of things that there were was never any vindication.
That's just amazing to me. Were any of the white sailors charged after the truth came to light, especially once you talk about some of them perjuring themselves or providing false statements? Did any of these white sailors face any consequences?
Well, that in itself is an excellent question, because there was one white sailor. I brought a motion during the trials against the Navy for selective prosecution, because under the U.S. Supreme Court decisions, you cannot selectively prosecute whites or blacks or people for any reason. And it was a very good motion to be brought, but shortly after we brought the motion, they made the decision, the legal officer, to bring charges against a single white sailor. Now, this is 4 months after the incident. And I state in the book, I think that the reason that he brought charges against that white sailor was because he wanted to have some counter to our motion that only black sailors were charged. But even this was an injustice, because they made the decision that that white sailor was going to be prosecuted by a new JAG officer who had just reported to the law center, who had no experience in contested cases. And I quote from, in my book, this young JAG officer, his name is Mike Sheehy. And matter of fact, I spoke with him earlier today, and he's going to come to the academy to watch me give that presentation. but he was fresh out of Navy Justice School. He had no co-counsel, even though all other cases prosecutors had co-counsel. And the verdict came back not guilty in 18 minutes. And I quote him in the book that he said he was just stunned by being appointed to take on this case when he had zero experience. He had no co-counsel. And in the book, Mike is quoted as saying, all the jury panel had time for was to go back, take a vote, and come back to the courtroom. So yes, there was a single white sailor charged, but that was the out. And I state that is basically one of the final injustices of all those trials.
Sounds like there's too many injustices to count going on here.
Yeah.
Do you still keep in contact with the sailors you defended, Marv?
You know, it's unfortunate. Cleveland Mallory, who features prominently in the book because he was the one that was unjustly acquitted on perjured testimony, he passed away 6 years ago, but I have been in contact with his sister back in Pittsburgh, and she's helped me with his story about his life both before and after that. Your viewers might be interested in the reason why I was threatened with being removed from the cases. It had to do with the fact that one of the civilian lawyers in California, retained by the NAACP, asked if he could fly aboard the Kitty Hawk while it was returning to San Diego. It was still a day out of arrival. And I said, sure, I'll see what I can do. And so I contacted the air control officer at the Naval Air Station, and he said, sure, we have these regular flights that go out once a day to carry mail to the carrier. These are prop jobs. And I talked to the pilot, and he said, sure, just bring this attorney over to the air station. And he flew out to the Kitty Hawk. Well, as a result of him being flown out to the Kitty Hawk that day, about 3 hours later, the convening authority, the commanding officer of the Naval Air Station, called me and said that he was going to throw me off the cases. He was just irate. And I said, what is going on? And that's the last I had a chance to talk for several minutes as he berated me. He said, you have violated a regulation that says civilians cannot be flown aboard carriers while they're in transit coming back to port in the United States. Of course, I knew nothing of that regulation, but that's what prompted that decision to have me removed as counsel. And of course, that escalated when I tried to remove him and so forth. So, yeah, there were a lot of things that were going on that you never would have expected in a normal trial. And I have to say, and I'm probably going to get back to that earlier question, I have to say that I have a tremendous amount of respect for the military justice system, both before these trials and after these trials when I was sitting as a military judge. So these cases really were an aberration. And I think your viewers have to ask themselves, why were they an aberration? Why all these injustices? And I think the obvious conclusion can be made as to why these injustices all were piling up against just these Black sailors.
Yeah, certainly. And we hear, this sort of theme ever present throughout the Vietnam War. Whether it's in the Navy, the Marines, the Army, this constant persecution, the constant judgments against Black service members as opposed to white service members. And not to make light of the topic, because this is a very serious topic, and you've done a fantastic job, Marv, putting this book together and also your presentation today. But just myself, I'm just curious, and maybe it's too soon. You said the book just came out in October, but have you been approached by anybody to maybe form this into some sort of motion picture? I think this would make a fantastic movie, and it would just really bring the true story out into the public sphere, I think.
Nothing has come to fruition yet, and my agent tells me that this is something that you would expect, if it's going to happen, maybe 2 or 3 years down the road. So that's all a possibility. I'm just a very happy camper to get this story out. As I might have told you, Eric, I thought I was going to self-publish the book as a first-time author, but I was extremely fortunate. I got a very seasoned veteran book agent here in Colorado after 2 days of inquiry, and he got a publisher in Chicago within 2 weeks. And so I'm just very pleased that the story is getting out. And of course, I'm, again, very appreciative of folks like you who have brought these other venues to make it available for me to get the story out. And that's what it was all about. I wanted to get the story out. I have gotten the story out. And whether the book does anything in terms of sales, beyond what it's already done, or whether or not there's a documentary or even a feature film, it would just be an additional plus. But I have to say that I'm very happy, and I feel very fortunate that the book has gotten the publicity it has gotten. For example, the San Diego Union Tribune putting on a front page story in the Sunday edition was totally unexpected, but very welcomed.
Well, Marv, we thank you so much. We've got a lot of positive comments in the chat function here about people just thanking you for bringing this story to light, to be able to tell this story and get these sailors, true emotions and just everything that happened to them out there in the public view. It's often difficult to do that, especially when you're talking about the military. A lot of information is shut down and closed off. So what you've done here is a great service, not only defending these gentlemen, but also being able to write this book as well. So thank you for taking some time today and joining us. And I'd also like to thank our audience members out there for joining us on this Monday afternoon as well. I hope you enjoyed the presentation as much as I did. And as a matter of fact, I can tell that you did by all your comments. And I just want to remind everybody that our next book talk will be on March 20th. We will be continuing our 50th commemoration of the exit of the Vietnam War. And this book talk on March 20th, we'll be talking to Dr. Mark Moyer, and he'll be talking about his newest work, Triumph Regained, the Vietnam War, 1965 to 1968. You can sign up for that event on our website, wisvetsmuseum.com/events. So we look forward to everybody coming out for our next book talk on March 20th. And once again, Marv, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a fantastic talk, a lot of great information, a little disheartening in parts, but just to know how everything turned out and all the hard work that you and your team did to get these gentlemen some sort of justice is just applaudable and amazing for sure.
Well, thank you again. And thank you for your viewers. I appreciate it.
I hope everyone has a great rest of the day, and we look forward to seeing you next time.